The early morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Madison Avenue's most exclusive boutique, casting elegant shadows across racks of designer clothes. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where wealthy shoppers typically browsed in peace, but today would be different. Andrea Chen, dressed in comfortable weekend clothes, worn jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and her favorite old sneakers, pushed open the heavy glass door. The little bell above tinkled softly, but the sound seemed to echo through the nearly empty store. She hadn't bothered dressing up. After 6 months of non-stop work launching new products and finally securing her position as CEO of NextGen Solutions, she just wanted to buy something nice for her mother's birthday in peace. The store clerk, Diane, looked up from behind the counter, her perfectly penciled eyebrows rising slightly as she took in Andrea's casual appearance. Instead of greeting her, Diane quickly picked up her phone, turning slightly away as she pretended to organize some papers. Andrea noticed the reaction but chose to ignore it. After 15 years in the tech industry, she was used to being underestimated. She moved toward a display of elegant scarves, running her fingers over the silk, imagining how the deep purple one would look against her mother's silver hair. Officer Robert Thompson was having a rough morning. 3 domestic disturbance calls, a fender bender, and now this, a suspicious person report from one of the city's fanciest stores. As he pulled up in his patrol car, he was already forming a picture in his mind, based on the clerk's description: suspicious individual in casual clothes, behaving oddly around expensive merchandise. The moment he stepped into the store, his eyes locked onto Andrea. She was now holding a scarf in one hand and checking the price tag with the other. Without bothering to observe further or speak with the clerk first, he strode purposefully toward her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to put that down and step away from the merchandise," he announced loudly, his hand resting deliberately on his belt. Andrea looked up, startled. The purple silk scarf slipped from her fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. Several other shoppers who had wandered in turned to stare, their phones already coming up to record what was happening. "Is there a problem, officer?" Andrea's voice was steady, though her heart had begun racing. She'd dealt with situations like this before, but it never got easier. "We received a report of suspicious activity," Officer Thompson said, his tone dripping with authority. "I'm going to need to see some identification and any receipts for items you might have selected." Andrea took a slow, deep breath. The familiar mix of anger, hurt, and determination washed over her. "Officer, I'm shopping for my mother's birthday. I haven't purchased anything yet, as I just arrived. Would you like to check the security cameras to verify that?" A small crowd had begun to gather near the entrance. Officer Thompson shifted uncomfortably but doubled down. "Ma'am, if you cannot produce identification, I'll have to ask you to leave the premises." Andrea reached into her pocket, pulling out not just her driver's license, but also her company ID, the one with Chief Executive Officer, printed in bold letters beneath her photograph. "Here's my identification, Officer Thompson," she said calmly, noting his name badge. "I'd also like your badge number and the specific reason for this intervention. Was there a particular suspicious activity reported, or was it just my presence in this store?" The officer's face began to redden as he looked at the IDs, then back at Andrea, then at the IDs again. The whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers grew louder, and several phones were now openly recording the encounter. Just then, a well-dressed woman gasped from the doorway. "Oh my God, Andrea." "Andrea Chen? I just read about you in Business Weekly." The woman turned to Officer Thompson. "Do you have any idea who this is? She just closed the biggest tech merger of the year." The atmosphere in the store shifted palpably. Diane, the clerk who had called the police, suddenly appeared incredibly interested in straightening a rack of already perfectly arranged dresses. Officer Thompson's hand dropped from his belt, and his face shifted from authority to uncertainty. But Andrea wasn't done. This moment wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who had ever been judged by their appearance rather than their character. She picked up the fallen purple scarf, smoothing it carefully between her hands. "Officer Thompson," she said, her voice clear enough to carry to the onlookers still recording, "I would like to purchase this scarf. Then I'd like to have a conversation about why you felt it necessary to approach me the way you did. Not to file a complaint, though I could, but because I believe in the possibility of change. Would you be willing to have that conversation? The first chapter of this story was about to become something neither of them expected. The beginning of a transformation that would ripple far beyond the walls of that boutique on Madison Avenue. The tension in the boutique was thick enough to cut with a knife. Officer Thompson stood frozen, Andrea's company ID still in his hand, as whispers and phone cameras continued to capture every moment. But what happened next would change everything. "I asked you a simple question, Officer Thompson," Andrea said, her voice remaining steady. "Are you willing to have that conversation?" She noticed his fingers tightening around her ID, his knuckles turning white. The crowd held their breath waiting. A young teenager in the growing audience whispered to her mother, "Mom, isn't she the one who started that scholarship program for girls in tech?" The whisper carried across the now silent store, making Officer Thompson's face flush even deeper. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Ma'am, procedure requires me to thoroughly investigate any reported suspicious activity." His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "I'll need to check your bag." Andrea looked at her small shoulder bag, then back at the officer. The absurdity of the situation might have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. "Officer, let me be very clear. You have no probable cause. I've shown you my identification. Multiple people here can verify who I am. Your continued harassment is not only unprofessional but likely illegal." The store manager, a middle-aged woman named Linda, finally emerged from the back office, looking horrified as she took in the scene. "Officer, there must be some mistake. Ms. Chen is a regular customer." But her words trailed off as Officer Thompson raised his hand to silence her. "I'm just doing my job," he insisted, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. The phone cameras kept rolling, capturing his increasingly defensive posture. Andrea took a step forward, her movements deliberate and calm. "Your job, Officer Thompson, is to protect and serve. Tell me, who are you protecting right now? Who are you serving?" She gestured around the store. "Look around. Really look. What threat do you see?" The other customers had formed a loose circle around them. Among them was a retired judge who had been shopping for his wife's anniversary gift. He stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Officer, I believe you're on very thin legal ice here. I'd strongly advise you to reconsider your position." Officer Thompson's radio crackled to life. "Unit 247, status update." The voice of his supervisor cut through the tension. Before he could respond, Andrea reached for the radio. "May I?" she asked, her eyebrow raised. Caught off guard, Officer Thompson nodded stiffly. "This is Andrea Chen, CEO of Next Gen Solutions," she spoke into the radio. "I'd like to request a supervisor at Madison Boutique on Fifth Avenue. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The response was immediate. "Copy that, Ms. Chen. Supervisor en route. Officer Thompson, stand down." The crowd murmured as Officer Thompson's posture deflated slightly. But Andrea wasn't interested in public humiliation. She had bigger plans. "While we wait," she said, addressing not just the officer but the entire store, "let me tell you about my first job interview in tech. I showed up in my best suit, which I'd bought secondhand, and the receptionist asked me if I was there to clean the offices." A few gasps emerged from the crowd, but Andrea continued, her voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. "I didn't get angry. Instead, I became that company's youngest project manager. 6 months later, that same receptionist was attending my team meetings. We ended up becoming good friends." The story hung in the air as Officer Thompson finally found his voice. "My sister," he said quietly, surprising everyone, "she's trying to get into tech. Says nobody takes her seriously." Andrea's eyes softened slightly. "What's her background?" "Computer science. Top of her class. But 3 years of rejections." "Give me her resume," Andrea said, pulling out her business card. "Not because of what happened here today, but because talent shouldn't be overlooked due to anyone's preconceptions." The store had grown so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. The arriving supervisor found the scene very different from what he'd expected. Andrea and Officer Thompson sitting on the boutique's plush chairs, having what appeared to be an intense but civil conversation about systemic bias and real-world solutions. Linda, the store manager, had brought out water for everyone. The other customers, still recording but now with a different purpose, witnessed something rare. The beginning of understanding between two people who, minutes earlier, had been locked in conflict. "Your sister's not the only one facing these battles," Andrea was saying. "But change happens one conversation at a time. Even difficult ones, especially difficult ones." As the supervisor approached, notepad in hand ready to take statements, he paused. The scene before him wasn't one of conflict anymore, but of transformation. The boutique had become an unlikely classroom, and everyone present was learning a lesson more valuable than any luxury item on the shelves. The purple silk scarf still lay forgotten on the counter, a silent witness to how a moment of prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for change. Outside, the morning sun had risen higher, casting different shadows now, as if the world itself had shifted just a little bit on its axis. The security footage told a story that no one could deny. On the boutique's large office monitor, Andrea's entire shopping experience played out in crystal clear detail. The store's owner, Mrs. Harrison, sat with the police captain and Andrea, watching the morning's events unfold with growing dismay. "Stop the video right there," the captain said, pointing to the moment Andrea first entered the store. 23 seconds. That's all it took from when Mrs. Chen walked in to when your employee called the police. He shook his head, scribbling notes on his pad. Mrs. Harrison dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. "I've owned this store for 30 years. This isn't who we are." She turned to Andrea. "I can't begin to apologize enough." But Andrea's attention was fixed on another screen, her phone. The incident had exploded online. #boutique buyers was trending, with millions of shares and comments. News vans had already started gathering outside the store. "Look at this," Andrea said, showing them a viral post. Someone had pieced together different angles of the confrontation from various shoppers' phones. But it wasn't just angry comments flooding in. People were sharing their own stories, thousands of them, about similar experiences in shops, restaurants, and offices across the country. The police captain leaned back in his chair, his face grave. "Officer Thompson's body camera footage matches everything we're seeing here. There was no justification for this stop. None." He looked directly at Andrea. "The department will be issuing a formal apology." Andrea set her phone down. "I don't want apologies. I want change." Just then, there was a knock at the office door. It was Linda, the store manager, holding a tablet. "Mrs. Harrison, you need to see this." "Our store's review page." But before she could finish, Andrea's assistant burst in. "Ma'am, I've got the board of directors on the line. This story's hitting the financial news. Our stock is actually going up. People are calling you a role model for handling this with such grace." The room fell quiet as everyone processed this information. Andrea stood up and walked to the window, looking down at the growing media circus below. In just a few hours, a simple shopping trip had turned into something much bigger. "Mrs. Harrison," Andrea said, turning back to face the room, "what's your hiring process like?" The store owner blinked, surprised by the question. "Standard retail procedures." "Why?" "Because I'm not interested in destroying your business. I'm interested in making it better." Andrea picked up the purple scarf, the one that had started it all, from where it still lay on the office desk. "This scarf is beautiful, but what's more beautiful is opportunity." She laid out her idea. The boutique would become the pilot location for a new retail training program focusing on eliminating bias in customer service. Officer Thompson's sister, the one trying to break into tech, would help develop the training software. The police captain nodded slowly. "If you're willing, we'd like to use this case as part of our department's training to show them how quickly assumptions can escalate, how badly things could have gone." Mrs. Harrison's eyes lit up. "We could do workshops, not just for retail, but for any business. Show them how to handle, well, how not to be like we were today." Andrea's phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from Officer Thompson himself. "My sister cried when she got your email about the software development position. Thank you for seeing past my mistakes." Outside, the crowd had grown. But they weren't angry protesters. They were people waiting to share their stories. News reporters interviewed shoppers who'd witnessed the incident. Social media influencers were going live, discussing privilege and prejudice and the power of keeping cool under pressure. Linda came back in, this time with tears in her eyes. The phones won't stop ringing. But it's not complaints. Other stores want to know if they can join the training program. Once it's running, I mean. Andre smiled, finally allowing herself to feel the weight of the morning's events. She picked up her phone and opened her calendar. "Book them all," she said to her assistant. "Every store that wants to learn. And call my tech team. We're going to need a bigger platform for Officer Thompson's sister to work with." The captain stood up, extending his hand. "Mrs. Chen, I've been on the force for 25 years. I've seen incidents like this go very differently. You had every right to be angry, to demand punishments. Instead, you're creating solutions." "Sometimes," Andrea replied, shaking his hand, "the best revenge is making sure nobody else has to go through what you did." She turned to Mrs. Harrison. "Now about that scarf, I'd still like to buy it for my mother. And maybe we can talk about displaying it alongside a sign about today's events." Mrs. Harrison burst into tears again, but this time she was smiling. "The scarf is yours, no charge, and yes to everything else. Let's make this mean something." By late afternoon, as Andrea finally left the store, the crowd parted respectfully. Someone started clapping, and soon the whole street joined in. But Andrea wasn't interested in applause. She was already on her phone, working with her team to set up the training program's framework. The purple scarf around her neck caught the late afternoon sun, its color somehow deeper and more meaningful than it had been that morning. A symbol not just of style, but of change. 2 weeks after the boutique incident, the police department's conference room was packed. Police officers, store owners, and community leaders sat shoulder to shoulder, their attention focused on the front of the room. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful. "Play the video again," the police chief requested, his eyes fixed on the screen. The now familiar footage from the boutique played out, but this time with a different purpose. They weren't watching to assign blame, they were watching to learn. Officer Thompson stood at the front of the room, his uniform pressed crisp, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I made assumptions that day," he admitted, pointing to his own actions on screen. Assumptions that could have ended very differently if Mrs. Chen hadn't shown such remarkable patience. In the back of the room, Andre sat quietly, taking notes. She hadn't planned to attend this training session, but Officer Thompson had personally requested her presence. His sister sat beside her, clutching a laptop containing the first draft of their new training software. "Look at my body language here," Officer Thompson continued, freezing the frame. "See how I'm positioned? I was ready for conflict before any existed. That's not protecting and serving, that's creating tension where there was none." A young officer raised her hand. "But what if there had been a real threat?" "Good question," Officer Thompson nodded. "Let's break down what a real threat looks like versus what unconscious bias makes us think is threatening." The discussion that followed was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but necessary. Officers shared their own experiences, both as law enforcement and as civilians. Store owners talked about their fears and prejudices. Community leaders offered perspectives that many in the room had never considered. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, the boutique had reopened with a different energy. The purple scarf that had started it all was indeed on display, but not for sale. It sat in a simple frame with a plaque that read, "Where Change Began." Mrs. Harrison had transformed her store's hiring practices. Her new staff reflected the diversity of the city itself, and customers noticed. Sales were up, not despite the incident, but because of how the store had chosen to respond to it. Back at Next Gen Solutions, Andrea's office had become a hub of activity. Her tech team, led by Officer Thompson's sister, was putting the finishing touches on their bias training software. They'd named it Mirror because it helped people see their own prejudices reflected back at them. "The simulation is ready for testing," Officer Thompson's sister announced, her confidence growing with each presentation. "Users can experience both sides of bias incidents. We've included real scenarios, including," she paused, glancing at Andrea, "our own." The program was revolutionary in its simplicity. Using virtual reality and real-world scenarios, it placed users in various situations where bias could affect their judgment. Police officers could experience what it felt like to be unfairly profiled. Store workers could feel the sting of being prejudged. Everyone could learn from everyone else's experiences. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some people resisted the changes. Anonymous comments online questioned whether the incident had been that big a deal. Others suggested Andrea was capitalizing on the situation for publicity. She addressed these criticisms head-on in a company-wide email that later went viral. Change isn't comfortable. It's not supposed to be. But comfort isn't as important as progress. The real breakthrough came during a test run of the Mirror program. A skeptical veteran officer put on the VR headset, experiencing what it felt like to be on the receiving end of bias. 20 minutes later, he removed the headset with tears in his eyes. "I've been that guy," he admitted to the room. "I never knew how it felt on the other side. Never really thought about it." That evening, Andrea sat in her office, looking at the framed magazine cover on her wall, her first as CEO. Next to it now hung a new frame containing a simple purple scarf. Her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Thompson. Training session was a success. 20 more departments want the program. You were right. Change happens one conversation at a time. She smiled, remembering how differently this could have all turned out. Her assistant poked her head in. The community center called. They want to know if you'll speak at their youth program next week. Apparently, they've had a surge of young people interested in both law enforcement and tech careers. "Book it," Andrea replied without hesitation. "And call Officer Thompson, see if he'll join me. And his sister too." As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through her office windows, Andrea thought about that Sunday morning that had changed so many lives. The incident could have been just another viral video, another angry headline, another reason for people to choose sides and drift further apart. Instead, it had become a bridge. A difficult, uncomfortable, necessary bridge that people from all walks of life were choosing to cross. The software would soon be in police academies across the country. The boutique's training program was being adapted for retail chains nationwide. And somewhere in the city, a purple scarf in a frame reminded everyone who saw it that change was possible. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from Officer Thompson. "My sister just got promoted to project lead. She says it's all thanks to you. But we both know it's thanks to that Sunday morning when you chose education over anger." Andrea replied simply, "No, it's thanks to all of us choosing to learn from it." 3 months after the boutique incident, Officer Thompson sat in his patrol car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. He looked the same, but anyone who knew him could tell you he was a different person. The morning briefing had just ended, and he was thinking about how much had changed. Remember, his sergeant had said earlier, "Today we're implementing the new response protocols that came from the Mirror program." The other officers had nodded, many of them wearing small purple pins on their uniforms, a symbol of their commitment to change that had spread through the department like wildfire. His radio crackled to life. "Suspicious person reported at Grove Street coffee shop." Officer Thompson's hand hesitated over the radio. This was exactly the type of call that had led to the boutique incident. "Unit responding," he replied, but this time he did something different. "Dispatch, requesting details on specific suspicious behavior, not just appearance." The dispatcher paused, then came back. "Caller says, actually, let me speak with the caller again. Stand by." A few minutes later, update. Caller admits person is just sitting alone with a laptop, wearing a hoodie. No suspicious activity observed. Officer Thompson smiled. The new protocols were working. Simple questions were preventing unnecessary confrontations. He drove by the coffee shop anyway, glancing in through the window. A young person sat working on their laptop, probably a college student getting some studying done. Back at the station that evening, he found a stack of letters on his desk. Fan mail, his colleagues joked, but they were actually thank you notes from community members who'd noticed the change in police behavior. One caught his eye. A handwritten note from a teenager who'd been in the boutique that day. "I want to be a police officer," the letter read. "I used to be scared to say that, but seeing how you handled everything after that day, how you chose to learn and grow, it showed me that people can change, and systems can too." The next morning, he attended a community breakfast where Andrea was speaking. The crowd was different now. Police officers and business owners sat mixed in with community members, all wearing those same purple pins. The walls between them had started to crumble. Andrea spotted him in the crowd and waved him up to the podium. "Officer Thompson and I have a story to tell you," she began, But it's not about what happened that day in the boutique, it's about what happened after. Together, they shared how the Mirror program had spread to police departments in other cities, how businesses were reporting fewer bias incidents, how his sister's tech career had taken off, inspiring other women to pursue their dreams. But the real change, Officer Thompson added, taking the microphone, happens in small moments. Like yesterday, when I got a call about a suspicious person. He explained how differently he handled it, and the room nodded in understanding. After the breakfast, he drove to the boutique for his regular community check-in, something that would have seemed impossible 3 months ago. Mrs. Harrison greeted him warmly, showing him their latest initiative, a mentorship program for young retail workers, teaching them not just about fashion, but about treating everyone with dignity. Coffee, she offered, gesturing to their new cafe corner, another change they'd made to make the store more welcoming to everyone. As they sat talking, customers came and went, a diverse mix of people all feeling equally welcome. His phone buzzed, a message from his sister, "Big presentation today. Nervous but ready. Thanks for being my inspiration to keep pushing for change." He typed back, "You're the one inspiring people now. I'm just the guy who learned the hard way." Later that afternoon, during his patrol, he spotted a familiar face, the college student from the coffee shop incident that never was. They were leaving the library now, still wearing their hoodie. Their eyes met, and instead of fear, there was recognition. The student waved, and Officer Thompson waved back. At roll call that evening, the sergeant made an announcement. The Mirror program's results are in. Bias-related complaints down 70%. Community trust up 60%. And it all started because 2 people chose to learn from a bad situation instead of letting it divide us more. Officer Thompson fingered the purple pin on his uniform. He remembered the anger he'd felt that day in the boutique, not at Andrea, he realized now, but at his own biases, his own fears. The transformation hadn't been easy. There had been tough conversations, uncomfortable realizations, moments when he'd wanted to give up. But then he thought about his sister, thriving in her tech career. About the young person who wanted to become a police officer. About the coffee shop student who could study in peace. About all the confrontations that would never happen because people were learning to see each other as human beings first. His radio crackled again, another call coming in. But now, as he reached for it, he did so with new eyes, a new perspective, and a changed heart. The transformation wasn't complete. It never would be. But each day, each call, each interaction was a chance to do better, to be better. As he drove through his evening patrol, he passed the boutique. The purple scarf in its frame caught the last rays of sunlight, a reminder that change wasn't just possible, it was happening, one person, one moment, one choice at a time. 6 months after the boutique incident, the city's largest conference center was buzzing with activity. Breaking barriers, from conflict to community, read the banner stretching across the entrance. Inside, something remarkable was taking place. Andrea stood at the back of the packed auditorium, watching as Officer Thompson's sister commanded the stage. Her presentation on the Mirror program's latest updates had the audience captivated. The software had evolved far beyond its original scope, now including scenarios from schools, hospitals, and corporate environments. "What makes this version different," she explained, clicking to the next slide, "is that it's built on real stories from real people, including my own brother's story of transformation." She gestured to where Officer Thompson sat in the front row, still in uniform, still wearing that purple pin that had become a symbol of change. The conference had drawn people from across the country. Police departments, business owners, community leaders, and tech innovators all gathered to learn from what their city had accomplished. But it wasn't just about the Mirror program anymore. It had become something bigger. During the lunch break, Andrea wandered through the exhibition hall. The boutique had set up a booth, but instead of displaying clothes, they were showing videos of their new training programs. Mrs. Harrison stood proudly beside a group of her diverse staff members, all sharing their experiences with visitors. "We've trained over 500 retail workers so far," Mrs. Harrison was saying to an interested group of department store executives. "And it's not just about preventing bias incidents. Our sales have gone up 40% since we started making everyone feel truly welcome." At another booth, Officer Thompson was demonstrating the latest VR simulation. A skeptical police chief from another city put on the headset, experiencing what it felt like to be unfairly profiled. When he removed it 15 minutes later, his hands were shaking. "I've been a cop for 30 years, he said quietly. "Never thought about it from this side, never really understood." The afternoon sessions focused on real-world implementation. Community leaders shared stories of successful programs. Store owners talked about changing their hiring practices. Police officers discussed how the new protocols had improved their relationship with the community. But the most powerful moment came during the open mic session. A young store clerk stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "Last week, a customer accused another customer of stealing. Instead of calling the police immediately, I remembered my training. I approached both customers with respect, started a conversation. Turned out the accuser was embarrassed afterward. She realized her own bias. Both customers ended up shopping together, talking, learning from each other." The room erupted in applause. Andrea caught Officer Thompson's eye across the room. They both knew that single interaction represented everything they'd been working toward. Later that afternoon, Andrea led a panel discussion titled "Technology as a Bridge." Officer Thompson's sister shared the stage with her, along with other tech leaders who joined the initiative. They discussed how virtual reality and artificial intelligence could help people understand and overcome their biases. But technology is just a tool, Andrea reminded the audience. The real change happens in human hearts and minds. The Mirror program works because it helps people see themselves, really see themselves, and choose to be better. As the day wound down, something unexpected happened. The conference center's cleaning staff, who had been quietly working in the background, asked if they could share their experiences. Andrea immediately handed over the microphone. "We've been watching all day," one of the cleaners said. "And you know what? For the first time, people have been looking us in the eye, saying thank you, treating us like we matter. That's what real change looks like." The final session of the day was a community dinner where police officers served food to attendees, a simple but powerful gesture that broke down more barriers. Officer Thompson, still in uniform but wearing an apron, served plates alongside community members he once might have viewed with suspicion. As people ate together, shared stories, and exchanged contact information, Andrea watched from a quiet corner. Her assistant approached with some impressive numbers. 30 cities had signed up for the Mirror program, 50 major retail chains had committed to the training, and 15 police departments had already implemented the new response protocols. But the real success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the scene before her. People from all walks of life, sharing meals and stories, seeing each other as human beings first. The purple pins that had started in their city were now visible on lapels and uniforms across the room, a growing symbol of commitment to change. Officer Thompson joined her, carrying 2 plates of food. "You know," he said, handing her one, "when you first suggested this conference, I thought it was too ambitious. But look at this, look at what people can do when they choose to learn instead of judge." As the evening wrapped up, participants lingered, reluctant to leave. Plans were already being made for next year's conference, but everyone knew the real work would happen in the days between. In stores, on streets, in everyday interactions where people would choose, again and again, to see each other differently. The last attendee to leave was the skeptical police chief who had tried the VR simulation. He stopped by Andrea's table, shook her hand, and simply said, "We'll be implementing the program next week. Thank you for showing us a better way." Outside, the city lights twinkled as people headed home, many wearing purple pins, all carrying something more valuable than conference materials, the knowledge that change was possible. And they were part of making it happen. 1 year to the day after the boutique incident, the city's largest television station was doing a special broadcast. The studio lights were warm as Andrea and Officer Thompson sat side by side, both wearing their now famous purple pins. "So," the interviewer began, "1 year ago, a simple shopping trip changed everything. Did either of you expect to be sitting here today?" They exchanged knowing looks. "Not in my wildest dreams," Officer Thompson admitted. "I thought that day would end my career. Instead, it gave me a new purpose." The screen behind them showed clips from the past year. The Mirror program being adopted by police departments nationwide, retail stores transforming their training, communities coming together in ways that once seemed impossible. "The numbers are impressive," the interviewer noted, reading from her cards. Bias-related incidents down 85% in participating cities, community trust in law enforcement up 75%, retail sales increased by an average of 45% in stores that implemented the training. But let's talk about the human side of this story. The camera panned to show a live feed from the boutique, where Mrs. Harrison was hosting a community gathering. The store had become a symbol of transformation, its purple scarf still proudly displayed, but now surrounded by photographs documenting the year's journey. "What makes me proudest," Andrea said, watching the feed, "isn't the numbers. It's the small changes we see every day. Like yesterday, I watched a police officer help a lost child find their parent. Instead of immediately assuming the worst, the officer started with compassion. That's the real change." Officer Thompson nodded. "My sister, who's now a tech executive, by the way, she tells me stories about young women who've entered the tech field because they saw what happened here. They saw that change is possible, that barriers can be broken." The interview cut to pre-recorded clips from around the country. A store clerk in Texas describing how she stopped a potential bias incident. A police chief in Oregon explaining how the Mirror program had transformed his department. A business owner in Florida showing off her newly diverse staff. Back in the studio, the interviewer held up a familiar object, a purple pen. "These have become quite famous. I understand there's a waiting list to get one." Andre smiled. "We never meant for them to become a symbol, but people started asking for them after the conference. Now you have to earn them by completing the training and showing real commitment to change. They're not just accessories, they're promises." The broadcast shifted to live feeds from various cities where Mirror program graduations were happening simultaneously. In each location, new graduates were receiving their purple pins, making their own commitments to change. "But it hasn't all been smooth sailing," the interviewer prompted. "No," Officer Thompson agreed. "Change is hard. We still face resistance. Some people think we're making too much of this, others think we're not doing enough. But we keep going because we've seen the difference it makes." The screen showed security footage from the original incident, but now it was being used as a teaching tool in police academies and retail training programs nationwide. "Looking back at this footage now," Andrea reflected, "I see something different. I don't see an angry officer or a wronged customer. I see the moment that taught us all how to be better." The broadcast cut to lit footage from the city streets, where something remarkable was happening. People were going about their daily lives, but there was a noticeable difference. Store security guards chatting friendly with customers, police officers walking their beats with new awareness, people from all walks of life interacting with genuine respect. "Your initiative has spread to other countries now," the interviewer noted. "What's next?" Andre and Officer Thompson shared another look. "We're launching an education program in schools," Andre announced. "Teaching children about bias before it takes root." Officer Thompson's sister developed an age-appropriate version of the Mirror program. And Officer Thompson added, "We're expanding into healthcare, education, and corporate environments. Anywhere people might face bias, we want to help create change." The interview ended with a surprise. The mayor appeared via video link to announce that the day would now be officially recognized as Community Transformation Day. But the real surprise came when the studio doors opened and in walked the young college student from the coffee shop incident that never happened, now a newly graduated police officer, purple pin already in place. "This is why we do it," Officer Thompson said, standing to shake the new officer's hand. "This is how change becomes permanent." As the broadcast ended, Andre and Officer Thompson walked out of the studio together. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of purple, as if nature itself was acknowledging their journey. "You know what I realized?" Officer Thompson said as they reached their cars. "That purple scarf, the one that started it all, it was never about the scarf." Andre smiled. "No, it wasn't. It was about the choice we all make when we face our own biases. The choice to learn, to grow, to change." They looked out over their city, where thousands of purple pins now caught the fading sunlight, each one a promise to keep choosing better, to keep learning, to keep transforming. The story that began with bias and confrontation had become something else entirely, a blueprint for change that anyone could follow, one small choice at a time.